Hi everyone, welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today I'm going to walk you through how to build a Python microservices that returns a list of 10 random African countries using FastAPI. FastAPI is an amazing super fast framework that makes creating APIs super easy and fun. So whether you are new to microservices or looking for a faster framework, this video is for you. We will be creating a small project that pulls random African countries complete with their names, populations, and capitals using Fast API, and also create an API that will find a specific country by name from the list. If the country is not found, it will return a custom JSON response explaining it is not on the list. So we will also explore best practices, including setting up a virtual environment and structuring the project. Let's get started. First thing first, before we dive into code, let's set up our environment. We'll use Python virtual environment to manage our dependency. Here is how to do that. Open your terminal, then create a folder named African Countries API. In the African countries folder which we created earlier, we will have to set up our virtual environment to manage our dependencies by running Python 3. Now when we check our Visual Studio Code, we can see that the virtual environment has been set, the folder has been installed locally on our machine. You can see the folder here, venv. What does this command means? Python use the program called Python. Why -m here calls a module as a script. We will tell it which module next. venv here use a module venv that normally comes installed with Python. Why dot or period venv? Why period venv here creates the virtual environment in the new directory. You can see it creates the virtual environment in the new directory here. Now to fast API documentation. This is how to activate the virtual environment while after installing. So to activate the virtual environment for Linux or Mac OS user, run source.venv bin activate. Then for Linux or Mac OS user, copy the command below and run it on your terminal. And also for a Windows user that uses PowerShell, copy this script below, copy the command below and paste on your PowerShell to run. If you use a bash for Windows, then copy the command below then and run on your Windows bash. To activate the virtual environment for Linux or Mac OS user, use the command below as instructed. For Windows user, you can use this for PowerShell or use this for Windows bash, but currently we are using a Mac OS device, so I will be using this command here. So back to our terminal, copy this, go back to our terminal, then we'll paste. copy this, we go back to our terminal, then we paste to activate our virtual environment. Now our virtual environment are successfully activated. So now we've successfully activated our virtual environment. Now you may ask why virtual environment. If you check through this FastAPI documentation, it is well explained why virtual environment is needed in our project. To work with FastAPI, you need to install Python first. After that, you would need to install FastAPI and other packages you want to use. To install packages, you would normally use the pipe command that comes with Python or similar alternatives. Nevertheless, if you just use pipe directly, the packages would be installed in your global Python environment. The global installation of Python, you might be like, what is the problem installing the packages in the global Python environment? At some point, you probably end up writing many different programs that depends on different packages, and also this project you work on depends on different version of the same packages. For example, you could create a project called Philosopher's Stone. This program depends on another package called Array. Using the version 1, you need to install Array. The Philosopher requires Array version 1. Then at some point later, you create another project called Prisoner of Azkaban, and this project also depends on Array, but this project needs Array version 3. You can see now the problem is, if you install the packages globally in the global environment instead of in a local virtual environment, you will have to choose which version of Array to install. So if you want to run Philosopher's Stone, you will need to first install Array version 1. For example, this pipe install Array version 1, then you can see the command, and then you would end up with Array version 1 installed in your global Python environment. So, but then if you run Prisoner of Azkaban, but then if you want to run Prisoner of Azkaban, you will need to uninstall Array version 1 and install Array version 3, or just install Array version 3 would automatically uninstall version 1, just the way it is here, and then you would end up with Array version 3 installed in your global Python environment. And if you try to run Philosopher's Stone again, there's a chance it would not work because it needs Array version 1. So tips: it is very common in Python packages to try the best to avoid breaking changes in new versions, but it is better to be safe and install newer version intentionally, and when you can run the test to check everything it works correctly. So now just imagine that with many other packages that all your projects depend on, that is very difficult to manage, and you would probably end up running some projects with some incompatibility, with some incompatible versions of the packages, and not knowing why something is not working. Also, depending on your operating system, for example Linux, Windows, Mac OS, it could have come with Python already installed, and in that case it probably had some packages pre-installed with some specific versions needed by your system. If you install packages in the global Python environment, you end up breaking some of the programs that came with your operating system. The solution to the problems of having all the packages installed in the global environment is to use a virtual environment for each project you worked on. A virtual environment is a directory very similar to the global one, where you can install the packages for a project. This way each project will have its own virtual environment with its own packages. Now you may ask, what does activating a virtual environment mean? When you activate a virtual environment, for example, using the Linux or Mac OS command or the Windows powered shell or Windows bash, this command will create or modify some environment variable that will be available for next commands. One of those variable is a path variable. You can visit a FastAPI documentation to get yourself familiar on how to use FastAPI with your Python. The link to the FastAPI documentation will be dropped in the description below. Now, if activating a virtual environment adds its path.venv/bin on the Linux or Mac OS or .venv/scripts on Windows to the path environment variable. Let's say that before activating the environment, the path variable looks like something like this on Linux or Mac OS or like this on Windows. After activating, the path variable would look something like this on Linux or Mac OS, while like this on the Windows. This means that the system will now start look for program in this before looking in the directory. So when you type Python in the terminal, the system will find a Python program in this, in our home user code awesome project .venv/bin/python, and use that one. An important details is that it will put the virtual environment path at the beginning of the path variable. The system will find it before finding any other Python available. Anytime you install a new package into your virtual environment, make sure you activate the environment again. This makes sure that if you use a terminal program installed by that package, you use the one from your virtual environment and not any other that could be installed globally, probably with a different version than what you need. The next thing to do here is to install the FastAPI by running pipe install FastAPI now. Now your environment is ready to go. Now that our environment is set up, let's move on the structuring. Now that our environment is set up, let's move on to structuring the project. We'll keep it simple but modular. You have to create two files named main.py and data.py. Main.py will be our FastAPI entry point, while data.py will hold our list of African countries. Now that our environment is set up, let's move on to structuring the project. We'll keep it simple but modular. Create two files, main.py and also data.py. dot py. The main.py will be our fast API entry point, while the data.py will hold our list of African countries. Keeping things modular ensures the project is maintainable and scalable in the future. Now, let's write some code here. In data.py, we will store a list of African countries and then create a function that returns a random selection of them in main.py. We'll define a fast API route that calls this function and return a response, and also another fast API route that will find a specific country by name from the list. If the country is not found, it will return a custom JSON response explaining it is not on the list. Simple and clean. Now here we've stored a list of African countries, and then let's now create a function that returns a random selection of them. Here's a function get random countries. In our data.py file, we created in our data file we store a list of African countries and then create a function that returns a random selection of them. In our main file, we will define a fast API route that calls this function and returns a JSON response, and also another fast API route that will find a specific country by name from the list. If the country is not found, it will return a custom JSON response explaining it is not on the list. Now we are importing fast API and the HTTP exception from, and also importing data let's create our fast API instance. Create our fast API instance. Then let's define the route that returns random African countries. Now let's return a list of 10 random African countries. Then let's define another route to find it. Now let's define another route to find a specific countries by name from the list. Now let's define another route to find a specific country by name from the list. Here we convert the country name to lowercase to make this search case insensitive. Then we also search for the country name to lowercase to make the search case insensitive. Here we'll search for the country in the countries list. Now, if country is not found, it will return the 404 error with a custom message. Now let's run our code. Now let's run our code by using the FastAPI command to run our code. FastAPI dev main.py. Now let's run our code by using the FastAPI to run our code in the development environment. Now let's run our code in the development environment by using the command below. Okay. Now let's run our code by using this command, FastAPI dev main.py. Now you can see our code has run successfully. Now let's view your microservice will be live on this port. Your microservice will be live on this port as shown on the screen. You can see the countries. Just open the link from your terminal. Just open the links from your terminal as shown here on the browser /countries, which is the APIs to get the list of the countries. So you can also interact with the API document by visiting the HTTP local URL to the docs. You'll see the automatic interaction API documentation provided by Swagger UI. You can see the one that reads the countries, and likewise the one that gets the countries. You can see find the specific, you can you can interact by finding the specific countries from the list. If the country is not found, it will return a JSON response explaining the country is not on the list. You can try this out by typing Nigeria. You can see the response here, name Nigeria, population 180 million. This works fine. It works perfectly. Now let's make an example of data that doesn't exist in the database by typing California. By typing by typing New York City. You execute this by typing New York City. You would see that it returns 404 error not found, that is country New York City not found in the list. So our APIs, our code is working perfectly as expected. For alternative API documentation, you will see the automatic documentation provided by Redo by visiting the URL here as highlighted. You can find it here by visiting this URL here. You see the alternative. You can also visit the alternative automatic documentation provided by Redo here. You can also visit the alternative automatic documentation provided by Redo here. You can see the URL. So you can see this get request, this read the countries, why this one gets the countries, and that is it. You've just built your first Python microservice with FastAPI. If you get stuck, you can get the link to the source code in the video description. You've just built your first Python microservice with FastAPI. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what you do like to learn next. Happy coding.